Hi everyone, welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. I'm your host, Paige Fullman. Today we're talking about something that started as a safety measure, turned into a lifestyle, and is now somehow a political battleground: remote work. What was once hailed as the future of flexibility just 5 years ago is now being painted as everything from un-American to unproductive, depending on who you ask. The question of how remote work became so politicized and whether it is here to stay has been heavy on a lot of workers' minds. Today, we have someone here who will walk us through the rise and fall, potentially, of remote work, the dynamics at play, and what the future of remote work might look like. My guest today is Brittany Rastsmith, a remote systems and operations consultant and the founder of Bloom Remote. Brittany helps early-stage remote startups scale without chaos, designing the systems behind hiring, communication, and team performance that actually make remote work. She's also a founding member of the Future of Work Alliance, a collective dedicated to shaping the future of work into something we can be proud of. With a background in building sustainable, people-first operations, Brittany specializes in solving the messy human challenges that hold remote startups back. You can learn more about Brittany and her work at bloomremote.com. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Brittany. Brittany, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you about this today.
So I'm hoping we could go kind of big picture about the connection between remote work and politics. It's not always been a controversial topic, but now it really feels like it's a political litmus test of sort. What has changed?
So I think the first thing that's really important to understand is that this isn't a new thing. This is just the latest chapter in an ongoing tug of war where workers gain some autonomy, usually through some kind of technological innovation, and employers respond by trying to claw that autonomy back, often by politicizing the issue and branding the workers as being unpatriotic, un-American, lazy, whichever words resonate with the crowds of today, as part of their effort to go back to what happened before that latest technological innovation changed the balance of power. So what happened was we have had a whole bunch of new technology come out in the last 10, 20 years that has made remote work possible in industries where it would have been unimaginable even 10 years ago. And AI is only making this happen faster, right? And as this opens up new ways to work, and as this opens up new avenues for people to be able to have more autonomy over their workday, and for workers to have more choices, and for that balance of power to shift, employers are responding with the same old playbook they used in the Industrial Revolution. You're lazy, that's bad.
That just seems to be the way it always goes with, any advancement. It becomes a weapon of sorts, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And I know that one of the things that we're going to want to talk about is about why this is happening now and why individual employers make the choices they do. And I'll tell you then that this is complicated and nuanced and that there's no blanket statement that covers everything. But the long and the short of it is that this is an age-old struggle between individual autonomy and hierarchical control. That's it.
Right. So why do you think, especially in the context of American politics and culture, why do you think remote work has become so polarizing?
Okay, so do you remember, and I can't pull the exact date to mind right now, but the marriage equality fight, and how quickly things started shifting, and how after a few states legalized it, there was a huge backlash of people trying to change the Constitution, both at the federal and the state level. And all of a sudden, it was all everyone could talk about for a little while. And there was just this huge push back against all the gains that have been made with that progress. It's the same thing. Yeah. This is a super common social pattern that we see over and over and over again, where something gets supercharged by some special event. In the case of remote work, it was COVID, right? We all went home, or not all of us, but many of us, most of us went home for at least a little bit. And everyone who could work from home was suddenly expected to work from home. And it was messy and it was sloppy and most of it was poorly done. But even that terrible version of work from home was enough for a lot of people to go, hey, my life could be radically different and better if I had the flexibility to work from home, and I could stop commuting, and I could stop wasting time sitting around at the office pretending to be busy, and I could stop living my whole life basically around the structure of driving into and coming home from an office, right? And They said, wow, I want to do this. I don't want to stop doing this. And remote work skyrocketed, led in large part by the demand from workers, especially highly qualified workers. People who get to pick where they work are way more likely to say, I'm only going to work remote. And so that exerts enormous pressure on the system. But if you remember what we were just talking about a minute ago, in that battle between autonomy and control, hierarchical control, the response to increased autonomy and having more worker power is to have a top-down press. And our new administration has said, yes, we would be very happy to exert this hierarchical control for you. And so we're seeing this strong backlash against what's happened, but it's not special. I guess that's the thing I really want to say. Nothing about this is special. If you're a student of history, everything about what's happening is completely normal and understandable.
Right. And you touched on this a little bit, that this isn't a debate about productivity, but it is more exerting power and control in the workplace. What ways does that kind of show itself, the power and control aspect?
So one of the things that's true about any new movement or change or anything that's different is that it takes a little while for us to start collecting research and really understand what's happening, right? And one of the problems right now with all the different distributed work models, whether they're remote, hybrid, work from anywhere, work from home, there's so many terms and they all have various weights to them, is that we haven't defined anything clearly enough yet for us to be able to be collecting meaningful research. And I want to give you a very specific example of that. I was reading a paper that came out. You probably saw it too. It got a lot of press. Well, the articles about it got a lot of press. I'm not sure anybody really read the paper, but they were like, remote workers are the least engaged workers of all kinds of workers. They had like, I don't remember, 32% engagement, something like that. It's terrible. If you believe remote work doesn't damage engagement, you're wrong. And everyone came out going, proof, look, workers disengaged. See, they're just sitting at home, not caring about us. Those lazy, unpatriotic slobs who are trying to undermine our hard American work ethic. This is very nationalized. It's very strange how much like patriotic language we're using here, but it's also very American. When you dug into what that paper was about, because it just said remote workers, right? What they had done is interviews with, and surveys really, which are the lowest form of research, is to do a survey and nothing else, about call center workers. Now, I want to just talk about a second about call center workers. Whether you go in somewhere to work at a call center or you do it at home, you are tied to your phone. You're not allowed to take more than your prescribed bathroom breaks. You are strictly technologically monitored no matter where you are. Call center jobs are low autonomy jobs. They are stressful. People are mean to you. There's a lot of turnover. They're bad jobs. I don't think anyone's going to argue with me that a call center is where somebody dreams of ending up. They're just bad jobs where you're treated as disposable, right? Guess where else has super low engagement besides remote call center workers? In-person call center workers have super low engagement, very similar to their remote counterparts, right?
Well, that tracks.
Okay, so here's the deal. We are saying this terrible job that has across the board low engagement, where people are treated very poorly and work in very difficult conditions. When they work remotely, they have low engagement. But instead of saying that, what they said was, see, remote workers aren't engaging with their employers.
Right.
What does that call center worker have to do with your marketing director or your social media manager or 3 client success advocates who all work remotely, but in jobs where they have autonomy and the ability to decide how to do their work to best reach their goals, and also flexibility somewhat to do it in a way that's going to fit with the rest of their lives? It's just not comparable.
Right.
And so to pull it all the way back, the problem that we're seeing here is that since we don't have good definition to talk about these things and we don't have a common shared terminology for research, we can't show what's really happening with any degree of authority. People are trying, people are making strides. I'm actually working with the Future of Work Alliance right now. We've just started a project that I'm heading up that's about creating this definition to make it easier to conduct research and also for orgs to categorize themselves and know what to expect based on the kind of remote work they're offering, which makes a lot more difference than if you're remote or not. So when we think about this example of this research and what's coming out, we can see the way that the media, the powers that be, however you want to talk about it, heck, our own government through the Department of Government Efficiency is really shaping this narrative, so that people who are choosing remote work and who are advocating for it, instead of them advocating for a quality of life difference, autonomy, the freedom that technology has promised us, the whole idea is that as technology gets better, actual humans are supposed to have more time in their day for non-work things without reducing their productivity. we're seeing all of that get swept to the side and instead refocusing this on a narrative about how they're not being good, how they're being morally bad. That's what that un-American, unpatriotic argument is about, right? You're not pulling your weight. You're not performing the way that you should. And within organizations, we see a lot of employers who are concerned about that, whether they're pulling people back in the office through return to office mandates, which, by the way, aren't working out the way people think they are. I'm sure we'll come back to that later. But we see them turning to technological surveillance instead of saying, okay, clearly, especially not in office, but really anywhere, time isn't the correct metric. If what we're interested in is productivity, we should focus on productivity. They're not doing that, which is what they would do if it was about productivity. Instead, they're doubling down on time. Mouse jigglers. Is my Slack message going from green to yellow? Is my Teams showing that I'm active? Some places even make people turn their cameras on and watch them work all day. And all of this, I think, is an extremely clear signal that it's not about productivity, because that's not how you increase productivity. Those are only methods for ensuring control and restricting the autonomy of workers to be able to have flexibility in the way they approach their work.
Right. And you touched a little bit on the kind of the language aspect of it and how a lot of the words that people will use to be anti-remote work tend to be quote unquote patriotic. How have politicians or political parties used the remote work debate to appeal to certain voter blocs in the electorate?
So we're seeing a really pronounced difference in the way that return to office mandates, and especially in government positions, are being enacted in red states and blue states, right? This is clearly a partisan divide where red states are much more likely to go all in on saying nothing can be done remotely. Remote work isn't real work. It's not as good. And blue states are much more likely to look at what data we have that shows that remote work has been an incredible boon to productivity in a lot of sectors. I remember earlier this year hearing someone on NPR, he was the head of the patent department, talking about how if he was truly not allowed to have remote workers anymore, he had no idea what they were going to do, because a lot of the patent work, as you might imagine, is technology centered, right? It's about computers and AI and the internet and all the things that we all do all the time now. Nobody's inventing bifocals anymore, or at least it's not a lot of their work. So in order to correctly assess and assign those patents, which I think we can all agree is really important, that we don't give, for example, patents that are so broad that it shuts off whole areas of technological innovation, you have to have people on staff who have the deep knowledge of what's happening to be able to say, yes, this is the line, this is correct, I understand what this means and whether or not it infringes. But his concern was that he wouldn't be able to hire those people. He has been hiring remotely for a long time because the people he needs, one, don't live in DC, and two, couldn't afford to live in DC and wouldn't be willing to on the salary he's allowed to pay them. So he's looking for people with extremely high technological skills who are willing to work at the patent office for below market rates if they go to work at a private company. And now he has to do that with the people who live in or are willing to move to one of the most expensive areas in the country. And so it really goes to show how when you swing your fists and you scream about patrioticness and real work and control, you're overlooking a lot of the actual reality of what work looks like now and why it's so important to be able to have a distributed workforce.
Right. Do you think that, I look at the conversation and I almost feel like by using those patriotic appeals, it almost kind of draws in the more blue collar workers that literally do not have the possibility to work remotely. Do you think that has anything to do with it?
It does. When we think about what you do when you don't have facts on your side and you're trying to disrupt a narrative, one of the most common approaches is try to give people an enemy, right? You try to set up people fighting each other instead of fighting against this exertion of control. And so one of the things that can happen right now is this blue collar, white collar divide, because white collar workers are a lot more likely to be able to work remotely right now. But okay, so yes, I do think that's what's happening. I do think people are using a divide and conquer strategy to try to distract us from the real issue, which we should all be getting very savvy to. I feel like it is the number one play in the American politicians' playbook for the last couple decades, is to divide us against ourselves instead of focusing on what's really happening, which is extremely unfortunate.
Yeah.
So blue collar workers are kind of a tricky area for this, because on one hand, it does seem on first glance like, hey, there's a classist element here, because white collar workers are more likely to be able to do this. But I think what a lot of people don't understand are two really important things. One, white collar workers doesn't mean what it used to mean. We're not talking just about CEOs and ad executives. We're talking about teachers. We're talking about people who take call center jobs. I don't want to bring that up because I just said how terrible it is, but it's true that most of them are going, or many of them are going remote. There are people that are in various kinds of customer service work or customer engagement work. There's increasing amounts of social work that are being done remotely. And every year, heck, sometimes it feels like every day, our technology advances a little further, and things that were once considered to be impossible to do remotely become completely possible to do remotely. My father-in-law was a military pilot, and then he was a Delta pilot. And he said that one of the things that's happening right now is that we're training fewer military pilots, in his opinion, because they were more interested in training drone pilots. Drone pilots are remote fighter pilots. Think about that for a minute. You can be a remote fighter pilot. Would anyone have guessed that 20 years ago? So when blue collar workers say, hey, yeah, that's not fair, everyone should go in, what they're really doing is pushing back the date when they or their children would have also been able to benefit from this. If we can norm this up now, and we will, we're going to get there. We can establish what good remote work's like. We can define it so that we can study it and learn and get better. We can create a situation that really is value added for the people that are doing that. All of that is going to benefit every rank of jobs as their jobs become remote capable.
Right. What would you consider to be fields, or do you think there are any fields that will never be remote?
So tricky, right? Because technology changes every day, and things that I had no idea would ever be possible are happening now in my lifetime.
Right. I'm more thinking about, like, I don't know why this is where my brain is going, but like mechanics, like car mechanics, that can't be done remotely. Although I would say the way to flex that would be like a roving mechanic service, you know, where you set your own schedule and you go to people's houses. So, I mean, maybe my question was just stupid, because I think the answer isn't, you know, remote versus in person, but allowing people the autonomy and flexibility to, even blue collar workers that can't really do their work from home, to have that same flexibility.
I think that's a great way to frame it. I always think about healthcare first, right? Because you would have said, well, doctors will always have to be in person.
Yeah.
They have to touch your body. But you know what? Since the pandemic, I would say that fully half of all the doctor's visits of various kinds that my family has needed for whatever reason have been virtual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would say right now that things that involve physical goods, like if you work in a lab and you need to physically touch your microscope and drop the little bacteria on your slides, or if you work in a warehouse and you ship widgets or whatever it is, that those kinds of things will be some of the last to go. But honestly, would I be surprised to learn that, you know, at some point in the future, you can move all that stuff at a lab remotely, and that it's preferred because it maintains the sterile environment and it minimizes human error, or that eventually robots are going to do all of the fulfillment work at warehouses? Like, no, I just don't think anything's off the table. Landscaping, I guess. No, robots will do that too, I'm sure. Well,
that's such an interesting, you're like really making me think now about like the kinds of jobs that we have. And I think like ultimately what it's making me think is there's just a resistance to flexibility. Like I know I asked about like blue collar workers, and of course white collar workers has an expanded definition now, and most of those jobs can have the ability to be done remotely. But with blue collar workers, I think it's the acceptance of more flexibility that like ends up being the big change that needs to happen.
It almost sounds like you're describing a battle between individual autonomy and hierarchical control.
Really? You mean I'm understanding? Yeah, no, definitely. I don't know. Well, okay, so there's all this rhetoric now about, like you said, getting back to work and, you know, restoring the work ethic. How much of that is economic messaging and how much of it is more cultural and ideological?
I think one thing that's really important to understand is that a lot of people don't know how to manage or lead, but they've been able to get by on grit and charm and virtue of being there, and the fact that people are trapped in a room and really have nothing better to do than work. And so those people who arguably hardly know how to manage in person, but who are making it work more or less, when you get into a remote environment, that stuff isn't true anymore. Suddenly it really does matter if you have good performance measurement in place, if you have clear goals and processes, if there's ways for people to find answers to their questions without having to walk over and ask someone else to figure out what the answer is. Like if you've got good systems, good process, good documentation, total clarity on your goals, transparency about the information people need, good delineated decision-making systems that both record decisions that are made, but also empower the people that need to make decisions to make them without having to get 55 people to sign off first. Like, there's a whole bunch of things that if you have in place, remote work is absolutely every bit as productive as in-person work, maybe more. I personally am so much more productive at home than in an office. It's crazy. I am like a completely different worker if you bring me into an office. But at home, I can sit and look up and it's, oh my gosh, I just spent 6 hours in deep work and I didn't notice and I didn't eat. And I also forgot to drink any water. And I don't feel great now, but I just did so much really good work, right? I can't do that in an office. That never happens. You don't get into flow like that. There's too much going on, especially if you're in one of those open concept offices.
It's actually my worst nightmare.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, the office that I'm in now, we have like 3 cubicles next to each other, and even that's like pushing it for me.
Yeah, right? I actually really don't like to hear other people or smell them or listen to their noises or anything when I'm working. I just want it to be quiet and still. Anyway, you take those people, those managers that don't really know how to manage, but are rubber banding it together in an in-person place, and suddenly you put them remote and it stops working. The miracle is not that it doesn't work remote, it's that it ever worked in person, just to be very clear. A lot. So yes, there are people who are big picture thinking about control. I have actually talked to a lot of business owners who will flat out say things like, how will I know people are working if I can't watch them work? Which, okay. But I don't even just, I was on Texas Public Radio doing a call-in show about this at the new year and about the return to office mandates. And a guy called in and said, people used to have morals. They don't anymore. The decay of American work ethic. Those lazy SOBs will rob you blind. It's why we can't have free newspapers anymore. Disparaging other classes. I don't trust people to do anything, let alone work if I'm not watching them. I would never let my employees work from home because I know those lazy SOBs wouldn't do anything. I mean, it's classic, right? It's all the rhetoric, exactly what we were just talking about. Right. It's distrust, it's classism, it's that sense that remote workers are entitled and lazy and looking to scam their employers. And so that happens, right? There's people who are just eating up that rhetoric with both hands and are perfectly happy to make it their whole personalities. But we also have people who just can't make it work. And instead of saying, maybe I'm not a great manager and I should learn how to do this. Fun fact, most managers in this country were not trained to manage others. They did a good job as an individual contributor and they got promoted and they keep getting promoted until they stop doing a good job and then they stay there. It's called the Peter Principle. And it's really exciting if you think about the implications of that across our society. Most people get stuck in their worst job they've ever done, unless they're bad enough to get fired. So
which seems to happen few and far between.
Right? Because there's a lot invested in the system and there's a very good chance that their manager is in the same position. They don't want to call that out if they don't have to. Anyway, so these people have 2 choices. They can either do the hard introspective work of realizing they're not as skilled as they thought they were, of growing, of learning, of exposing their weakness and becoming better, which, by the way, is how you build a strong, sustainable company or team, right? People with little teams and little margins who don't do that stop being in business soon. It's only bloated corporations that can carry that kind of trash for very long. But you either do that hard work or you say, oh, it's remote work. Remote work makes everyone lazy. There's a really palatable to me narrative going around about that right now. I think I'm going to jump on that bandwagon, not because of anything about remote work or even because they know enough about it to have an educated opinion about it, but because they couldn't make it work because they didn't structure their systems to work in that environment.
Everybody's had a bad manager before. That's just the way life goes. And it's fascinating to me as somebody who works hybridly. My team, there's never been a moment where I've been, checking the status of somebody on my team and been criticizing them about if they were away or on their phone or whatever. And there's also not a moment where I've been hypercritical of what they're doing remotely. To me, everybody gets their work done. So it's interesting. Like, I'd love to get into the brain of somebody who is incredibly anti-remote work just to dig around in there and see why they think everybody's lazy. Like, is that because they would be lazy if they were working remotely and not actually doing the work? like, I just want to crawl into one of their heads really quickly.
And I think it's probably some of each, right? I think there's some people who are like, well, I would abuse the crap out of it. In fact, I am. But one of the things you just said, I think is really important. You said they get their work done. If you have clarity on why, and it's going to sound so basic, but so many people don't do this. If you have clarity on why you hired someone, not, oh, we needed a social media manager, so we hired one and now we have one and she does stuff on LinkedIn. So that's that. Not that. Like, why did you hire this person? What is their goal? What are they trying to accomplish? And by the way, if you can't answer that question about everyone on your team, you're not doing a good job. In general, any manager who cannot say for every person on their team, this is what they're here to accomplish, that's like the minimum threshold. You shouldn't even be allowed to hire someone without answering that question. But if you know it, then you can carefully design some metrics. You just need to pick numbers that actually represent the impact they were brought in to create, right? So you don't say, oh, I want my salesperson to call 100 people a day. You say, I want my salesperson to close a deal a week, right? That's worth at least $50,000. An outcome, not an input. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to track inputs. You should, because when somebody doesn't hit their outcomes, you want to be able to say things like, oh, well, it looks like you're only making half as many calls as you used to. That's probably why. Or, oh, gosh, look, there's a total breakdown at this step. Let's troubleshoot it together so that you can go back to being successful. Because that's what you're supposed to do as a manager, is give your people what they need to be able to successfully hit their goals. That's what your success is. But how can you do that if you don't understand? And if I sound stressed, it's because this really stresses me out. How can you do that if you don't know what you hired people for and you haven't figured out how to measure it, both in outcome and in the various inputs along the way that let you help them troubleshoot it when it stops working, right?
Right.
Just to wrap that up, I think a lot of people who struggle with that struggle because they don't understand those basic realities and they don't have those systems in place.
Right. I really like what you said about focusing on the outputs rather than the inputs. I mean, I think that goes back to the overall like control portion of the conversation, but I also think that like connects back to the productivity that we said. Like, you should be focusing on productivity rather than the inputs. Like, the inputs don't determine what the outputs are.
It doesn't matter what your inputs are,
right,
if you can't accomplish the outputs. Like, I think a lot of people get so twisted up in all of these fancy ideas about what business is and templates and processes and meetings. And they forget that what they're really doing is coming together to achieve whatever the goal of the organization is. And people have parts of that goal that they own, and they need to achieve their parts for the business to achieve the overall part. But everything else it's busyness, right? There's a lot of work that is busyness in contrast to productivity. Productivity is when you do something meaningfully that moves the needle, that puts your business in the position that it needs to be in to be successful and to continue to achieve its goals. Busyness is all the stuff that people fill their days with that doesn't do that.
Yeah, interesting. So I do want to shift the conversation to more social impact and equality. Some argue that the push back into the office disproportionately hurts women, caregivers, and people with disabilities. Do you believe that that's true? And how should we be thinking about inclusivity within the debate of remote work?
I mean, I don't know that there's an opinion to have about whether or not that's true. It's demonstrably true. There are a lot of people who cannot go into an office every day. Here's an example, a very, very mild example from my own life. My son has to be at school at 8:30 in the morning, and he gets done at 3:30 in the afternoon. My husband is a teacher in a different school district, and he has to be there earlier and later. He cannot do any of this without quitting his job and giving up on it entirely, right? He cannot be involved in pick up and drop off. In order for me to take my son to school and pick him up at the end of the day, I have to stop work for, say he's not very far away, maybe half an hour to take him and then get back to my desk, or to pick him up, bring him home, give him a snack, and come back to my desk. But if I had to go into an office, or I worked in a remote organization that I didn't have the flexibility to step away for half an hour, I couldn't have a full-time job. I could have very expensive add-on childcare on one or both ends that might make it so it's not even worth me doing that. And by the way, I would also not get to see my son, and he would spend all day in school and other people's care, literally all day until dinner time, waiting for someone to be able to come get him. And I know that's the reality for a lot of Americans, and I'm not saying anything about the choices people have to make. But for me, personally, that's not a choice I had to make, because I can do incredibly impactful high-powered, worthwhile work from my house. And no one I've ever worked for in the whole time I've been doing this has ever cared that I have to leave to get my son from school at 3.
Right. Well, and that's like, we talked about this before in our meeting before we recorded this. My mom has worked from home since before I can even remember. Like, I want to say since 2005 or 2006. Like, she was ahead of her time for sure. But even then, we still utilized a full-time nanny that was there from 8 until probably 4, mostly because, again, back in 2005, like, remote work was so novel and so new that, like, there was, one, she was incredibly busy, but 2, it was so novel in the fact that, like, they still kind of, the expectation was that there would be some level of control and that you couldn't step away for 30 minutes to get your kid from school. So, I mean, and that's changed at our company since then, but I can't imagine having a career and a husband and kids and both going into the office and still being able to make it work. Like, somebody has to give up. Right. 100%. And that's my mom's, like, whole thing is that she believes, I believe her belief is a little bit outdated, but she believes in a marriage where you have kids and you want to be active in their lives. There's only one person can have that kind of career where they grow up the ladder and are constantly occupied by work. You can't have both parents doing that without hiring some sort of outside help or, sinking money into something else.
There's so many things I want to say about what you just said. One of them, I will say, where I was reading something yesterday as I was refreshing my memory on a few things to get ready for this. And before the pandemic, remote workers were much more likely than their in-office counterparts to work 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. And we're starting to see that come down now, where remote workers and in-office workers are working much more similar sets of hours. But that's from remote workers working a lot more and now gradually coming down to the average amount. That's not from lazy remote workers stepping it up. And like, that's not what's happening.
Right.
One of the things I always had to be so careful of when I'm building remote teams is that I would bring in these really passionate, dedicated people, and they would deeply appreciate the flexibility of the work we're doing, want the ability to still do something that was important and meaningful and made them feel like they were using their whole brain and growing their skills and contributing to the world. Most of them had some kind of constraint, an elderly parent, a child, a disability of some kind. They live in a rural area, whatever it is. That made it really difficult for them to find and take work like that locally. One of the things I always had to watch for, and I would have this talk like clockwork with every new hire about 2 months after they'd start, was, hey, you are running yourself into the ground. You're never turning your computer off. You're never stepping away. You're emailing me at all hours of the night. This is not an 80-hour-a-week job. You need to pull back. And you need to, I understand that you appreciate this and you don't want to blow this opportunity. I appreciate you. You're doing a good job. You need to do a good job in a normal amount of time and not always be on the clock, because that is what remote workers are much more likely to do, is to work all the time to make sure that they are proving that they can be productive with this extra autonomy.
Right. Well, and that's back to my mom. This past Sunday, she got a ring light for her computer and she was like, can you help me set it up? It's a Sunday. She's not supposed to work on Sundays, okay? She unlocks her computer. We set up the ring light. And I hear her typing. I go, what are you doing? She goes, oh, I'm just sending an email really quickly. I was like, are you kidding me? She was like, I saw it came through. I'm like, that doesn't mean that you have to respond to it. Yes, you are remote. Yes, you have the flexibility to open your computer. You don't need to respond to it right this minute. It can wait 12 hours until Monday morning. It's okay.
Yeah. Oh, it's so true. I actually have put all kinds of nanny devices on my phone so that I will stop doing that, right? Like at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night, I make all my work apps go silent until the next morning, because I would find myself.
That's a great idea.
Not being involved. I'd be sitting on the couch watching a show with my son, or just be playing a game with my family, or cooking dinner. But what I was really doing was answering Slack chats for my team, or I was following up with a customer email, or I was jotting down some ideas real quick that I needed to remember tomorrow. And I wasn't living my life. It's important to do both.
Right. Well, and it's hard to set those boundaries, especially when you have, and it's nice to be able to have the apps on your phone so that when you do step away, and you're in the waiting room of your doctor's office, you can still keep up on what's going on while you stepped away. But it also, I think, subconsciously puts this extra expectation on the worker that you should be available to answer whenever.
Yeah. So I've been doing remote work since 2011, maybe 2013, something like that. It's been a while. It's been more than 10 years that I've been working completely remotely. That whole time, most of that time, I'm sorry, up until 2020, it was really not a thing people talked about very much. Sometimes I would mention it at a party and people would be like, weird, what? And, there's people who think you're not really working. But for the most part, nobody talked about it. I worked super hard. Everyone I worked with worked super hard. It was just never a problem. And then the pandemic happens and a lot of really bad remote work happens and it spikes how many people are working remotely and the demand increases. And then there's a big backlash against it. And people are trying to reestablish hierarchical control and keep worker autonomy from spiraling out of control the way they see it. And all of a sudden, there's this new narrative that I'd never been exposed to before, which was about how lazy remote workers are sitting around watching Netflix. And I just remember the first time I hear it being so shocked because it was so antithetical to everything I had ever experienced about remote work across all the different people I'd worked with. It was just, I understand now where it was coming from in the historical framework, and I see how it is exactly what I should have expected, but I had never been in the middle of a politicalization, a radicalization of something I'd already been participating in like this. I'd never been directly part of that backlash, and it was so startling and confusing. Honestly, I had to really hear it a couple of times. I was thinking, who are these whack jobs? What's going on? And then suddenly we have, our elected leadership in this country talking about that, parroting these points. And you're like,
right.
This just has no connection to what's happening on the ground.
And do you think some of it, for me, I'm only 25, so the only kind of frame of reference I have for working pre-COVID remotely is my mother. Part of what you mentioned is that when COVID first happened, there was this influx of remote work, and not all of it was well managed, which I think led to people truly having a lot of downtime because there wasn't a plan for this. There wasn't a plan to do this big switch. Do you think that contributed to the lazy remote worker rhetoric of people watching Netflix? Was that it was just poorly managed and so that was the outcome?
I do think there's some merit to that. I think that what I said before about how this is a very common narrative weaponized against workers trying to gain autonomy is ultimately true. But I also think it's true that research shows us pretty clearly that people who are working in offices are not spending most of their time on productive work. There was a big survey that came out earlier this year where white collar workers across unclear industries indicated that on average they spent about 2 hours and I think it was 36 minutes when what they would consider to be productive tasks every day while they're in office for 8 hours. That's like 2.5 hours, less than 3 hours of productive work a day out of those 8 hours. What are they doing with the rest of it? They're sitting in meetings that they don't consider productive. They're endlessly checking their email. They are talking at the water cooler. They're taking a lunch break. They're editing a document that doesn't really need it just to look busy. They're doing what I call productivity theater. It's when you fill your day to look busy because the person that managing you is managing you based on how busy you look. And I hope everyone hearing that can realize clearly how stupid that is. As a person who has a fiscal responsibility to an organization to manage people based on how busy they look and how they feel about them, vibes management, instead of the work they're actually accomplishing. Anyway, so you take those people who have 2-3 hours of productive work a day and you send them home. You have no good performance measurement, no good way to see if they're accomplishing their goals or not. You stack in a bunch of Zoom meetings to replicate your in-person meetings, which are, by the way, terrible, right? Not that Zoom meetings are worse than in-person meetings, but all useless meetings are terrible. You just feel yourself slowly spending your life just sitting, looking attentive, and you don't need to be there and nothing's happening. Everybody's having a bad time. People at home start to get nervous after a while. At first it was fun. It was like a vacation, but after a while you start to get nervous, like, oh gosh, now that you took out all those other fillers, I really don't work that much every day. Oh, somebody's going to realize this and I'm going to get in trouble and I'm going to lose my job. And the managers are going, crap, I have no idea what everyone's doing. When my manager says to me, tell me how your team spends your time, I don't have anything to say here. I should schedule some more meetings. I don't have something to say. Oh yeah, I talk to Brittany every day. She's definitely working because every day I ask her if she's working. It's a very predictable outcome. You have these people, they're not doing much work. You put them in an environment with less supervision. They have less to do. Their manager doesn't know how to manage them. Nobody's having a good time. It's stopped being fun. You're sitting on a couch trying to type on your laptop next to your spouse who's doing the same thing and your kid who's trying to do Zoom kindergarten, which, God, if you ever have a spare hour, we can talk about that. Because the schools weren't any more prepared for this than anyone else, right? Like, you imagine if you were in charge of teaching kindergarten and they said, tomorrow, You'll be teaching online to a bunch of kids who can't read yet. Go.
Right. Yeah.
So
that was like the craziest part of COVID.
It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. And that's when you learn that you don't have enough internet to run 3 simultaneous Zoom calls. And that's when you learn that you actually did get a little bit of quiet at your office because you're sure not getting it now. I always think about those poor people who live in like those tiny apartments in the middle of vibrant downtowns. And they always said, well, I don't care because this whole city is my backyard. And then suddenly they had to stay inside. It's like, that was rough.
Right.
I'm sure it left a bad taste in people's mouths, and I'm sure it contributed to this idea that remote work isn't real work, because what they're really saying is, when I worked remotely, I didn't really feel like I was working.
Well, that's what, I guess what I was trying to kind of poke at was that people that started working remotely pre-COVID did so with a plan, so to speak, where it wasn't thrust upon them. It was, this is how we do things. It is remote, and here's how we accomplish that. And, whatever it may be, that I feel like when COVID kind of pushed it on everybody, there was this panic of, we need to go back to normal. We need to go back to normal as soon as possible. And I feel like you have such a different outlook than workers that had just started working remotely during COVID and beyond. I don't know. I think it's a little bit like straddling that divide, and, you coming out and saying it is possible. I've done it since 2010, 2011, and everything's been fine, is really what people need to push forward. But I want to shift the conversation to the media, who has both helped and hurt remote work. I'm wondering if you could talk about how they've shaped that conversation, either by glamorizing it or also villainizing it.
So I think it's really interesting the role that the media has played in this entire journey from the start of the pandemic all the way through now and what's happening. And I think that with the rise of the 24-hour news cycle and the commercialization of journalism and the way that commercial interests underlie so many of these decisions, the media has been digging into these kinds of issues in a totally biased way that you wouldn't have seen, I think, unless I'm glamorizing the past. Maybe it's always been this way, but it seems like there's been a lot more specific targeting of agenda that's happening across a lot of different media channels. So when everyone went to work from home during the pandemic, what did we need? We needed people to work from home. That was the deal. We were shutting down. We needed people to stay home. That was the direction we took. And so all the media was about the glamour of working from home, the flexibility, the benefits, how to make it work, hot tips for making your office awesome, what to do when you have 3 kids at home, which, by the way, is not a normal thing for working at home, right? I wouldn't recommend that anyone try to have a regular job that they're doing while they're the person responsible for their baby. That's very difficult, and it's not going to produce good work, and it's going to burn you out because you're trying to do 2 hard things at once. That's not what I'm saying. But there was just a ton of really pro work from home is great rhetoric that was coming out, and all the studies and the articles and the salon thought pieces were all about how great this was going to be and how to do it well. And if you wasn't great, it was because you hadn't optimized your setup yet. It wasn't because it was intrinsically not great. And they did a really good job convincing people of this. I think part of what's happening right now is that all these people who spent that time optimizing their office and dreaming about staying home and realizing the very real benefits it brings to your life when you can get up when you're frustrated in the middle of a problem and you can't quite figure it out for work and go walk outside for 10 minutes or do a little yoga or pet your dog or do something that's going to actually make you feel better so that you can go back and untangle this thorny situation. People are losing something that was built up to them really strongly. And now we see this big media push that is all about going back to office. It's return to office, studies about remote work productivity and engagement that are extremely suspect when you look under the hood, like we were talking about earlier. It's the follower effect. There are a number of people who are bringing their employees back to office because they think that everyone is bringing their employees back to office, because every day for a while we were getting a new media coverage of people bringing their workers back to the office, even though most of those people didn't actually bring their workers back to the office full time. And if you look at it now, the number of days those employees were working at home versus are working at home now has not really changed for most of them.
Right. I just think about, my biggest one is, I think it was in Chicago at least, Amazon tried to bring everybody back to office 5 days a week, and they literally didn't have the seats for it. Like everybody showed up and was like, and where would you like me to sit? On the copying machine?
Yeah, there's no parking spots, or they didn't have computers for them, or none of them had badges. Like there's so many stories like that, but they're not the headline stories. And I want to know why not. In any other year, Amazon pulling everyone back and totally crapping the bed like that and not having a place for people to go would have been a headline story, right? That's the kind of Schadenfreude we all love.
You touched on this a little bit, but it felt reactionary. Like, oh, everybody's bringing people back to the office. Oh, we better bring everybody back to the office, even though we have no plan. It feels like companies were finally getting into the groove of what remote work looked like for them. And then all of a sudden, they had to change gears and they just fell into another trap of executing a plan with no idea how to actually execute it effectively.
Strong agree. You're right. They dove into remote work with no plan because they had to, but now they're exiting remote work the same way. And no one's making them do that. These are totally unforced errors.
That's like the weirdest part. There's no law against remote work, and they're, it's mind blowing to me. But I'm hoping we can end on a question of hope, potentially. If you had to guess, what do you think the remote work landscape looks like 10 years from now? And what can we do as employees, as managers, to shape that future?
Yeah. Okay, this is a hopeful one. I've talked about the pattern, right? Something happens, all of a sudden a movement gains steam faster than it would have organically. For us, it was the pandemic. And then it settles back out. You see a backlash, it pulls back, but not to the levels before. You almost never lose all that ground. And then you see steady building. And we're already seeing that happening. People aren't really going back to the office. A ridiculously high percentage of new small businesses that are started are completely remote. And we are just seeing signs of life for remote work everywhere. It's going to keep growing. We're going to keep increasing the technology. We're going to develop things that make more jobs possible to go remote. More and more people are going to push for remote work because honestly, it is a privilege that is extremely hard to give back once you've really tasted it done well. It gives you so much of your life back. It's becoming something that people who are in a position to choose where they work and demand the conditions they want are loudly demanding this. And it's just the arc of history. We're going to see remote work continue to grow and grow because there's a lot of business advantages for it too. You get better talent. You have fewer restrictions on who you can hire. There's huge cost savings once you get out of that expensive lease and all the other things that go into coming into work and having a physical footprint. 10 years from now, I think that we're not going to be talking about this anymore. We're just going to be seeing more and more and more remote work. It's going to become more normal. And the thing that we can all do now, business leaders, managers, employees, to bring that future about quicker is we can, one, commit to doing our jobs well. If you're a manager or a business leader, learn how to manage or lead remote teams if that's where you are. If you're an individual, learn how to be good at sharing your work, creating transparency, demonstrating productivity. There's a lot of things individuals can do to remove that friction and make it easier for their managers to do their jobs well. We all need to lean in, figure out what we need to figure out to normalize remote work, establish new norms for it so that it can be better and more successful, and to give more people really positive experiences with it. And actually, that's what I do. That's what my whole job is now. I am a remote systems and operations consultant, which means I work with small businesses to help them design the kind of systems that I've been talking about this whole time so that they can manage productivity, so they can get clear on their goals, so that they can give their employees autonomy and flexibility without compromising their business interests.
Right. Well, that's what I think you make a good point, that a lot of it is just educating on how to make remote work be beneficial for everybody.
That was actually one of the headlines I tested for my website. Let's make remote work work.
It's a good one. I just didn't want to use the word work twice, but yeah, no, I mean, I don't disagree with your assessment that we wouldn't even be having this conversation 10 years from now. And ultimately, I think it is just educating and getting people in leadership roles that are able to manage remotely without, the control and the hyper management of it all. And hopefully we'll live in a much more understanding society around the culture of work in a decade.
I hope so. I believe so.
Yeah, it's a little bit, glass half empty right about now, but I'm choosing to remain hopeful, as I think you are too.
You should. This is the backlash moment. We've seen this happen for so many issues across history. This is the worst it gets right now. It's all going to be up from here.
That's a great way to end it. Do you have anything else that you feel like I might have missed?
No, I thought that was really good. I hope this is what you were looking for.
Of course. Thank you so much for coming on.
I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing the episode when it comes out.
Yep. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. And thank you so much to Brittany for coming on and sharing her field of expertise. I feel like for so many people who are currently working, there is so much limbo about what your future of remote, hybrid, in-person work looks like. And I really feel like I left this conversation feeling a little bit more glass half full about the future of what being hybrid or remote could look like. And if anybody is interested in connecting with Brittany on LinkedIn, I will have her LinkedIn in the show notes so you can go and connect with her. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use this information. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and keep fighting for remote work. I'll see you guys next week in the briefing room.